My name is Luke Thompson. It was late into the night when I pulled up to the Elderwood Motel, a tiny, fading establishment on the outskirts of town. I had been driving for hours, and the exhaustion was hitting me hard. The only thing that mattered was finding a bed. The motel's sign was half lit, and the lobby was dark when I entered. A tall man with a pale face stood behind the desk, staring at the counter. "One night," I said. He didn't say anything, just handed me a key with a silent nod. Room dozy. As I walked away, I felt a strange sensation that I was being watched, but I shrugged it off. Room 12 was a strange place. The wallpaper was stained with age, and the air smelled faintly of something burnt. But I didn't cry, I just needed rest. I locked the door and lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. There was a faint noise, a distant sound of whispering. I sat up. The whispers grew louder, coming from somewhere inside the room. I got up and scanned the room. At first, I saw nothing, but then I noticed the mirror. It was slightly fogged up, and as I looked closer, I saw a figure in the reflection, a man, sitting on the bed. I turned around, heart racing. The bed was empty. I glanced back at the mirror. The man was still there, his face obscured by shadows, but he was moving. "Get out," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest. The figure in the mirror smiled, his grin widening until it seemed unnatural, stretching too far. I ran to the door, but when I opened it, the hallway was gone. Instead, there was nothing but an endless void of darkness. I slammed the door shut, my breath heavy. The whispers grew louder, and the man in the mirror started to speak again. "Leave now, or you'll never escape." I could feel the room closing in on me. The walls seemed to bend, pulling me toward the mirror. The darkness grew heavier, suffocating. I grabbed the key, turned the handle, and ran through the void, not knowing if I was still inside the motel or somewhere far worse. When I finally found myself outside, the motel was gone. In its place, only an empty field stretched before me. The sign of the Elderwood Motel was nowhere to be seen. My name is Benjamin King. I was on a road trip through the desolate stretch of Nevada when I saw the motel in the distance. It was small, isolated, and its sign flickered with a weak neon light. The Crescent Inn. The storm had worsened, and I had no other choice. The lobby smelled of stale coffee and dust. A woman with graying hair stood behind the counter, her hands shaking as she handed me a key. "Room 4, she said in a low, raspy voice. I took the key and glanced at the sign. "Vacancy. Are you sure?" I asked. "It looks empty." She nodded, almost too quickly. "You're the last guest." I felt uneasy, but the storm was fierce, and I needed a place to sleep. Room 4 was small, with cracked wallpaper and a flickering light bulb above the bed. The bed itself seemed strangely inviting, despite the state of the room. I locked the door, set my phone alarm for 7 a.m., and lay down. Then, at 3:33 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my door. Clump, clump, clump. I froze, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped. Then, a knock, soft, gentle, but persistent. I hesitated. My mind raced. Was it a staff member? A prank? The knock came again, louder this time. I crept to the door and peeked through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway was empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A soft voice whispered from the darkness, "Time to leave, Benjamin." I slammed the door shut, my hands shaking. I grabbed my bag, ready to run. But when I opened the door again, I wasn't in room 4 anymore. I was standing outside in the pouring rain, facing the motel's empty parking lot. I turned around. The motel was gone. In its place was a cracked, rusted sign, "Closed forever." My name is Nathan Wells. I was on my way to visit my sister when a sudden storm forced me to pull off the road. The only shelter nearby was a lonely, run-down motel called Silverwood Inn. The woman at the front desk looked up with tired eyes as I entered. She seemed surprised to see me. "One night," I said, shaking the rain off my jacket. She hesitated, then handed me an old-fashioned brass key. "Room 105, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I turned to leave, but her next words stopped me. "If you leave your room, don't come back." A shiver ran down my spine. "Excuse me." But she just turned away, staring at the wall. I found room 105 at the end of a narrow hallway. The door creaked open, revealing a musty room with peeling wallpaper and a bed that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I locked the door and settled in, exhaustion pulling at me. The storm outside raged, wind howling through the cracks in the windows. Then, at 1:05 a.m., the air changed. The silence became too thick. A soft knock echoed through the room. I turned toward the door. The knock came again from inside the closet. I sat up, my breath catching slowly. The closet door creaked open. I reached for my phone, but the screen was black. A figure stepped out of the darkness. It looked just like me. Same face, same clothes, but its smile was wrong. It tilted its head. "You're in my room." I bolted for the door and flung it open only to find myself standing back inside the same room. The door slammed shut behind me. The other me grinned wider. No one ever leaves room 105. My name is Daniel Harper. I was driving through the Midwest, heading home after visiting an old friend, when my fuel gauge hit empty. With no gas stations in sight, I pulled into the only building around a small, nameless motel on the side of Highway 23. The lobby was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of mildew. A man with hollow eyes sat behind the counter, drumming his fingers on the desk. "One night," I said, sliding a 20 toward him. He didn't blink as he handed me a key. "Room 6. As I turned to go, he muttered, "If the phone rings, don't answer it." His tone sent a chill through me, but I was too tired to argue. The room was worse than I expected. Faded carpet, cracked walls, and a TV from the 80s. The bed was stiff, but it didn't matter. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and collapsed onto the mattress. Then, at 2:30 a.m., the phone rang. I sat up, my heart pounding. It rang again. I reached for it, hesitating. A third ring. I picked up the receiver and put it to my ear. "Hello." Silence. Then, a whisper. "Why did you answer?" The line went dead. A knock sounded at the door, soft at first, then louder. I crept toward the peephole. A woman stood outside, her hair long and dripping wet, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She knocked again. "Let me in." I stumbled back. The TV turned on by itself, static hissing through the room. The phone rang again. I didn't answer this time. The knocking stopped. When I looked back through the peephole, the hallway was empty. At sunrise, I grabbed my bag and ran to the lobby. The front desk was covered in dust, the place abandoned. The motel wasn't just empty. It looked like it had been closed for years. My name is Jason Miller. I was on my way home from a business trip, but exhaustion crept in, forcing me to pull over at the first motel I saw. The sign flickered in the dark. Pine Hollow Motel Vacancy. The lobby smelled of dust and old wood. A young man with a blank expression sat behind the desk. His name tag read Todd. "One night," I said, reaching for my wallet. Todd frowned. "We're actually full." I gestured to the neon sign. "It says, vacancy." He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. Then, lowering his voice, he said, "Look, man, take my advice. Find somewhere else." I was too tired for games. "Come on, I just need a few hours of sleep." Todd exhaled, then reluctantly handed me a key. Room 214. But if anyone knocks, don't open the door. I nodded, too exhausted to question him. The hallway was eerily silent. Room 214 smelled faintly of bleach. The bed was stiff, the TV remote sticky, but I didn't care. I set my alarm for 6 a.m. and collapsed onto the mattress. I must have dozed off immediately, because the next thing I knew, a knock echoed through the room. A single, deliberate knock. My pulse quickened. Another knock, louder. I grabbed my phone. 3:33 a.m. Todd's warning rang in my head. Don't open the door. Then, a voice. Jason, let me in. My breath caught in my throat. My name. I crept to the peephole, heart hammering. The hallway was empty. Another knock, this time from the bathroom. I spun around, stomach twisting. I had checked the bathroom when I arrived. Was empty. A shadow moved behind the door. I'd grabbed my bag and bolted. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, the exit seeming farther with each step. I slammed into the lobby, panting. Todd looked up from his magazine. Told you, he said flatly. I didn't respond. I just ran to my car and sped off. As I reached the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The motel was gone. No sign, no building, just an empty lot. My name is Adam Clark. I had been driving for nearly 12 hours when my eyes started to blur. I needed a place to rest, and the only option was a worn-out motel off the interstate. Hollow Pines Motel. The place looked deserted, but the neon sign buzzed weakly. Vacancy. I walked into the dimly lit lobby, where a man in an outdated bellhop uniform sat behind the counter. His name tag was blank. One night, I said, sliding my card over. He gave a slow nod and handed me a rusted key. Room 108 as I turned to leave. His voice dropped to a whisper. No matter what happens, don't leave your room before dawn. A chill crawled up my spine. Why? But he only stared, his expression unreadable. I brushed it off and headed to my room. Inside, everything felt wrong. The wallpaper was stained, the carpet damp, but exhaustion won. I locked the door, turned off the light, and collapsed onto the bed. Then, at exactly 2:08 a.m., the sound started. A soft click, like a door unlocking. I sat up, my heart hammering. The door to my room was still locked, but the sound had come from outside. Another click. Then, slow, dragging footsteps. They moved down the hall, stopping outside different doors. Click, click, click. I held my breath, then my doorknob turned. I scrambled back against the headboard. The knob twisted again, harder. This time, then, a whisper. Time to check out. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the sheets. The knob stopped moving. The footsteps faded. I didn't move until sunlight streamed through the curtains. When I finally stepped outside, the hallway was silent. The other doors were wide open. Their rooms empty. At the front desk, the bellhop was gone. In his place, a dusty old sign sat on the counter. Motel closed since 1984. My name is Scott Avery. I was halfway through a cross-country road trip when fatigue hit me like a brick wall. The nearest motel was a shabby-looking place called Redwood Inn, sitting alone off the highway. It wasn't much, but it was cheap. The receptionist was an elderly woman with deep wrinkles and cloudy eyes. She barely glanced at me as she handed over the key. Room 13, she muttered. I forced a chuckle. Not superstitious, huh? She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned in slightly. Don't look in the mirror after midnight. I frowned. What? She waved me off. Just get some rest. The room was musty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something metallic. The only thing that stood out was the massive ornate mirror hanging on the wall across from the bed. I settled in, ignoring the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. By the time I checked my phone, it was already 11:45 p.m. I turned off the lights, but sleep wouldn't come. Something about the room felt off. Then, at 12:01 a.m., I heard a whisper, faint, almost like my own voice. I sat up, scanning the darkness. My gaze landed on the mirror. My reflection was sitting up to my chest tightened. I slowly raised my hand. My reflection did the same, but just a second too late. A cold wave of dread washed over me. The reflection smiled. I wasn't smiling. I lunged for my bag, grabbed my keys, and bolted out of the room. The receptionist was gone. The entire lobby was empty, as if no one had been there for years. I ran to my car and peeled out of the parking lot. As I hit the highway, I dared one last glance in the rearview mirror. My reflection was still smiling, and it wasn't me. My name is Eric Dawson. I was driving through the back roads of Montana when a storm rolled in, forcing me to find shelter for the night. The only place nearby was an old, run-down motel called Moonlight Inn. I parked in front of the lobby, the neon sign flickering weakly. The place looked abandoned, but the door creaked open as I stepped inside. A middle-aged woman sat behind the counter, her face pale and expressionless. She barely looked at me as she slid the guest book forward. "One night," I said. She hesitated. "We only have one room left." "That's fine." She handed me a brass key. "Room 207. As I turned to leave, she whispered, "Don't answer if someone knocks." I sighed. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" She didn't respond. The room was old but clean. The bed was stiff, the wallpaper peeling, but it would do for the night. I locked the door and lay down. Then, at exactly 2:07 a.m., the knocking started. 3 slow knocks. I sat up, pulse racing. Another 3 knocks. I tiptoed to the door and looked through the peephole. A man stood there, dressed in an old-fashioned black suit. His face was blurred, like a smudged photograph. "Room for one more," he whispered. My breath hitched. I backed away, clutching the key in my hand. The knocking continued, growing louder. "Room for one more." I grabbed my bag and bolted out. The back door? Rain pounded against my skin as I ran to my car. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man in the black suit was standing in the middle of the road, smiling. My name is Ethan Carter. I had been driving for hours, exhausted and desperate for a place to rest, when I saw the faded neon sign flickering in the darkness. Lakeview Motel vacancy. The building looked old, the paint peeling from its walls. But at that moment, I didn't care. I stepped inside the lobby, greeted by the musty scent of aged wood and something else, something metallic. Behind the counter stood an elderly man with hollow eyes and an unsettling grin. "Just one night," I said, sliding my credit card toward him. The old man's fingers trembled as he pushed the key toward me. "Room 306, he whispered. Don't answer if someone knocks." I hesitated. "What?" But he only shook his head, staring at me with those sunken eyes. I took the key and walked through the dimly lit hallway to my room. The air was stale, heavy with a dampness that clung to my skin. The room itself was small bed, dresser, and a flickering TV. I locked the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. Then came the first knock, soft, deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding. The old man's warning echoed in my mind. I ignored it, pulling the thin blanket over myself. Minutes passed. Then, another knock. This time, it was louder. I tiptoed toward the door, peering through the peephole. Nothing, just the dimly lit hallway. A whisper slithered through the door. "Ethan, let me in." My stomach twisted into a knot. My name. I backed away, grabbing my phone. No signal. The motel was in the middle of nowhere, and I had no way to call for help. The knocking turned violent, the door rattling in its frame. I grabbed the chair from the corner and wedged it under the doorknob. Then, silence. I didn't sleep. The hours crawled by, each creak of the motel settling, sending shivers down my spine. At sunrise, I cracked the door open and peeked outside. The hallway was empty. Relieved, I rushed to the lobby. The old man was gone. In his place, a younger woman stood behind the counter. "I need to check out," I said, my voice shaky. She frowned. "Sir, we don't have a room 36. I stared at her, my blood turning to ice. I turned toward the parking lot, my car in sight. I ran. I didn't stop until I was on the highway, the motel fading into the distance. I glanced in the rearview mirror just once. The neon sign was gone. The entire motel had disappeared. My name is Daniel Reese. I had been traveling for work, exhausted and drained, when I pulled into a nameless roadside motel just before midnight. The neon open sign buzzed weakly, casting a dull red glow on the cracked pavement. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and cigarette smoke. A woman with hollow cheeks and tired eyes stood behind the counter, absently flipping through a magazine. "One night," I said, tossing my credit card onto the counter. She barely looked at me as she handed over a brass key. "Room 9. Then, in a quieter voice, she added, "If you hear anything tonight, don't open the door." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She just shook her head. "Just don't." I took the key and made my way down the dimly lit corridor. Room 9's door was scratched, the number barely hanging onto the wood. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me. The room was plain beige walls, an old TV, and a stiff bed. The air smelled wrong, like something rotting. I checked the bathroom, the closet empty. Maybe it was just in the walls. These places were never well maintained. I lay down, exhaustion pulling me into a restless sleep. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the knocking started. Soft at first, rhythmic. I bolted upright. The woman's warning echoed in my mind. Another knock, harder this time. Then, a voice. "Help me." It was barely a whisper, a child's voice. I hesitated. No way was a kid out there at this hour. The knocking became frantic. The voice turned desperate. "Please, he's coming. Help me." A cold chill crept up my spine. I stood, slowly approaching the door. My fingers hovered over the handle. Then, a shadow passed beneath the doorframe. Something huge. The voice on the other side changed, deep, guttural. "I know you're awake." My heart stopped. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair. The doorknob rattled violently. Then silence. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Dawn eventually broke, golden light spilling through the curtains. I forced myself to check the peephole. Nothing. I packed my bags and bolted to the front desk. The woman was gone. In her place, an old man sat, flipping through a newspaper. I need to check out," I stammered. He glanced up. His gaze was dull. "There's no room 9. I turned, my stomach twisting. The hallway where my room had been was now just a solid brick wall. My name is Noah, and I never thought I'd experience something like this at a train station. It's been years, and I can still hear the sound of the train. ... It all started when I had to catch the last train out of Fairmont Station. It was an unusually quiet night, too quiet for a city like this. The station was nearly deserted, with only a few stragglers lingering on the platform. The clock on the wall showed 11:55 p.m. I had just enough time to get to the train. But something felt off. I walked to the platform, glancing over the tracks. There was no sign of the train yet, but I wasn't concerned. Just a few more minutes, I thought. I checked my watch. 11:59 p.m. Just as I was about to sit down, I heard the sound of a train's horn. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. I looked toward the tracks. The train was coming, but it wasn't like any train I had seen before. It was old, a relic from another time, its headlights dim but strangely bright against the fog that rolled in. The wheels screeched as it slowly approached, and my stomach churned with a mixture of unease and fascination. The train stopped right in front of me, its doors opening without a sound. There was no conductor, no announcement, and no passengers, just the empty train waiting for me. I hesitated. For some reason, I couldn't resist. Something about that train called to me. I stepped aboard, and the moment I did, the door slammed shut behind me, sealing me inside. The interior of the train was just as strange. The seats were old-fashioned, covered in faded velvet fabric, and the air inside was thick, like the dust of forgotten years. It felt like stepping into a different era. I walked down the empty car, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The train began to move, but there were no sounds of the tracks beneath us, just an eerie stillness. The windows were covered in grime, and I couldn't see anything outside. I felt like I was trapped in a void. As I continued to walk down the corridor, I noticed something strange. There were names carved into the wooden walls, old names, as if they had been etched in by someone desperate to leave a mark. I stopped and read one. It said, Eleanor, 1923. The date sent a chill through me. It didn't make sense. I walked further into the train, and that's when I saw the first person. A woman, sitting alone in a seat, her face obscured by her long, dark hair. I couldn't see her clearly, but I could feel her gaze on me. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, and no sound came out. Suddenly, the train lurched, and I was thrown to the ground. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw her standing at the end of the car, her eyes hollow and empty. She didn't speak, but her lips moved. I could hear her whispering something, but the words were indistinct, as if they were coming from far away. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. The train kept moving, faster now, and I couldn't tell where we were going. The woman's figure began to fade, replaced by another man, his face twisted with agony. "You shouldn't have boarded," he said, his voice a guttural growl. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was no escape. The train kept going, further into the darkness. Then, in a moment of clarity, I realized something that froze my blood. This train was forgotten. It wasn't on any schedule, and no one ever spoke of it. It was as if the train had been lost in time, carrying people who had no place to go. And now, I was one of them. I don't know when or if I'll ever return. All I know is that I'm still on that train, and I hear the whisper soft at first, but growing louder with each passing day. They're telling me that I'll never be forgotten. My name is Alex, and the events that happened on Platform 9 are still haunting me to this day. It was a typical Tuesday evening when I found myself at St. Andrew's Station, waiting for the 11:30 p.m. train. The platform was mostly empty, the usual crowd having already boarded their trains or left for the night. I had missed my earlier train and was left with an hour to kill. I paced along the platform, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. The night air was cool, and the station had an unsettling stillness to it. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:15 p.m. I walked past a few scattered benches, checking my phone, then glanced up to see a man standing on the far side of the platform. He was dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by the shadows. The strange thing was, he wasn't moving. I tried not to pay attention, but something about him seemed wrong. The longer I watched, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of dread creeping over me. I told myself to ignore it and started walking toward the other end of the platform, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I looked back, and sure enough, the man was still there, standing in the same spot. staring directly at me. I froze, his eyes black, hollow, pierced through the darkness, and in that moment, I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical presence. I turned and began to walk faster, but every time I glanced back, he was closer. I quickened my pace, and before I knew it, I was running down the platform. My heart was racing, and my breaths came in short gasps. I reached the end of the platform and turned to find the train finally pulling in. But when I stepped forward to board, I noticed something. There was no one else waiting to get on. I looked around, and there was the man again, standing just a few feet away from me now. His gaze locked onto mine. I couldn't explain it, but I was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't look away. The train doors slid open, and the man took a step closer, his breath shallow and quick. "You don't belong here," he whispered, his voice like a distant echo. I stumbled backward, panic flooding my veins. I reached for the door, but before I could enter the train, the lights went out. The station was plunged into darkness. I heard a faint whisper, followed by a cold, wet hand grabbing my arm. I screamed, but there was no one around. The air grew thick with the smell of decay. I looked up, and the man was gone. But there was something even worse in his place. A figure, tall and lanky, its features distorted, its body hunched and twisted. It was standing at the edge of the platform, watching me with a grotesque grin that stretched across its face. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in terror. Then, the train arrived. But it wasn't the train I had been waiting for. It was dark, the windows cracked and broken, and there was no sound coming from it, no engine, no movement. The doors slid open slowly. "Get on the train," the figure whispered. I was about to turn and run when I felt another hand on my shoulder, cold, clammy, and impossible to escape. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I stumbled toward the train, unable to resist. The door slammed shut behind me, and the train began to move. Its eerie silence, deafening, as I looked out the window. St. Andrew's Station disappeared into the fog, and I realized with horror I was no longer on the same platform. I don't know where I am, but I've heard whispers telling me I'll never get off. And the worst part? I can still feel the watcher's eyes on me. My name is Rachel, and it's hard to explain what happened to me at Waverley Station. Even now, I still feel like I'm being followed. It was nearing 3 a.m. when I arrived at the station, having just missed the last train. Waverley Station wasn't a busy place to begin with, but at this hour, it was downright empty. The station lights flickered overhead, and the air was damp, heavy with the smell of mold and rust. I sat down on one of the benches, the cold creeping through my jacket. I checked my phone, no signal. Suddenly, I heard a soft rustling noise. I turned, expecting to see someone approaching, but there was no one. I thought I might be imagining things, but then I heard it again. The rustling was coming from somewhere on the platform. I got up and walked toward the sound, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. To my surprise, there was a train at the far end of the platform. It wasn't listed on the schedule. It wasn't on the board, and there was no announcement. The train was an old steam locomotive, its metal body tarnished and worn. I approached cautiously. The train sat there, silent, with the doors slightly ajar. A thick, acrid smell wafted from the open door, like something had been rotting inside for years. I could hear a faint whispering coming from the train, but no one was there. I hesitated, but something pulled me closer. Curiosity, or was it fear, kept me from leaving. I climbed aboard. The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I stumbled forward, eyes adjusting to the dim light. The train was empty, except for the faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. The air felt wrong, like it was pressing in on me, thick and suffocating. I found my way to one of the passenger cars, the wood creaking under my weight. The whispering grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. Then, I heard something else, a soft, slow tapping, came from the far end of the car. I turned and saw the silhouette of a figure standing at the end of the aisle. It was too dark to see any details, but the shape was unmistakable. A person, but their features were distorted, stretched beyond recognition. I froze, unable to move. The whispering turned into soft, incoherent words. Rachel, ... The figure took a step forward, then another, slowly drawing closer. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. When it reached me, it stopped. Its face was a twisted mask of shadows and anguish, but its eyes locked onto mine. You shouldn't have come here. The voice was soft, almost a sigh, but it sent chills down my spine. In that moment, the train lurched forward. It began to move, though the tracks outside remained empty, covered in thick fog. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. The car began to sway, and the whispers intensified, now all around me. I kept my eyes fixed on the figure, unable to look away. It raised a hand, pointing directly at me. "You're ours now." Before I could react, the lights flickered, and everything went dark. I woke up in the same station where I had boarded the train. The doors to the locomotive now sealed shut, but I'm not alone anymore. I can hear the whispers following me, no matter where I go. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I see the figure in the shadows, still watching. My name is Ben, and I can't stop hearing the trains at night. It all started when I missed my last train home. I had been at Sycamore Station waiting for the 11:45 p.m. train, but when I checked the time, I realized I had fallen asleep on the bench. The station was empty, and the soft buzzing of the fluorescent lights was the only sound. I jumped up, cursing under my breath, and ran toward the platform, hoping the train was still there. But it wasn't. I checked my phone. It was now 12:10 a.m. There was no sign of the train, and the schedule board was blank. Panic started to creep in. I waited for a few minutes, but no one else came. It was just me, alone in the station. I sat back down on the bench, trying to calm my racing heart. The air was unusually cold for that time of year, and the stillness was suffocating. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of a train approaching. I looked up, and in the distance, I saw the headlights piercing through the fog. The train was coming. I couldn't believe it. The next train wasn't supposed to arrive until the morning, but this one was different. It was old, rusted, with broken windows and peeling paint. It slid into the station with a screech that made my teeth hurt. The doors opened, but there were no announcements. The platform was eerily silent. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to get on. I boarded the train, the dim lighting casting long shadows down the corridor. The air inside was thick and smelled faintly of mildew. The doors slammed shut behind me, and the train began to move. I took a seat by the window, peering out into the fog, but the landscape never changed. We passed the same dark, empty fields, over and over again. The train didn't stop at any stations. There was no conductor, no passengers, just the constant rumble of the train beneath me. I don't know how long I had been on that train when I heard the whisper. It started soft, just a faint rustling in the corner of the car. I glanced around, but there was no one else. Then it came again, clearer this time. Ben, ... double quotes. My heart dropped. I knew no one else was on the train. Ben, this is your stop. I looked down at the floor, and when I looked back up, the figure was standing in front of me. It was a man, tall and gaunt, his eyes black as coal. He was staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "You've been on this train too long," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the screeching wheels. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't move. It felt like the train was no longer moving, like we were stuck in an endless loop, circling the same tracks over and over again. "This is the last stop," he said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Suddenly, the train lurched to a stop. The lights flickered out, and the whispers grew louder, all around me. When the lights came back on, I was back at Sycamore Station, just like before. The platform was empty. The train was gone. I rushed out, but the man's voice echoed in my ears. "This is your stop, Ben. You're never leaving." That was the night I realized I'm still on that train. It never really stopped. I just never got off. My name is Emma. The events that unfolded that night at Westfield Station have left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. It was just past 1 a.m. when I arrived at Westfield Station. The night was cold and the wind bit through my coat as I walked to the platform. I had missed the last train home and was forced to wait for the first one in the morning. There was no one else around, only the flickering streetlights casting long shadows. I sat down on a bench, wrapped in my coat, trying to keep warm. The station was eerily quiet, no footsteps, no conversations, just silence. The only sound came from the occasional crackling of the loudspeakers. I checked my phone 1:15 a.m. A sudden noise caught my attention. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I glanced up and saw a man in a dark suit, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was walking toward the platform, but something felt off. His steps were too heavy for someone walking at such a slow pace, like they were forced. I turned away, deciding to ignore him, but the air around me grew heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel his presence, the weight of it, pressing in on me. I looked up again, and the man was standing in front of me. He hadn't made a sound. "Excuse me," I said, attempting to be polite. "Are you waiting for the train too?" He didn't respond. His face was still hidden beneath the hat. I repeated myself, louder this time, but the man remained motionless. Something about his silence was unnerving. Suddenly, the loudspeakers crackled to life, and the station lights flickered. My heart skipped a beat as the announcement came through. "Next train to Westfield will arrive in 5 minutes." The man slowly turned around, his face still hidden, and walked toward the tracks without saying a word. My curiosity got the best of me. I followed him, keeping my distance. I watched as he stepped closer to the edge of the platform, and then, without warning, he jumped. The sound of his body hitting the tracks was horrifying, like a wet thud. I gasped in shock and rushed forward, expecting to see him sprawled out on the rails. But when I looked down, the tracks were empty. There was no sign of him. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I imagined it? The train arrived moments later, its brakes screeching as it pulled into the station. The doors opened, and a rush of cold air spilled out. But I noticed something strange. The train was completely empty. No conductor, no passengers. Just the low hum of the lights overhead. I didn't think twice. I boarded the train, desperate to leave. But as the doors slid shut, I heard it a whisper, soft and chilling, coming from the corner of the car. "You shouldn't have followed me." I spun around, but there was no one else on the train. As we pulled away from the station, I glanced out. The window, Westfield Station, was gone. There was nothing left, just an empty void stretching out into the darkness. I haven't been able to sleep since that night. I keep hearing the footsteps, getting closer every time, and sometimes, I swear, I see him standing in the corner of my room, silent as ever. My name is Henry, and I should have never waited alone at Holloway Station. That it was a freezing winter night, and I had just missed my train. The next one wasn't due for another 40 minutes. The station was completely empty, the kind of silence that made my own breathing sound too loud. That's when I noticed the clock above the platform. It was unlike any station clock I'd ever seen, old, with a brass frame and Roman numerals. But something was off. The hands were moving backward. I stared at it, confused. maybe it was broken. A shuffling sound made me turn. At the far end of the platform, a man in a dark suit stood motionless, facing the tracks. His posture was stiff, unnatural. I couldn't see his face. I cleared my throat. "Hey, do you know if the next train is really at 1:15? He didn't respond. Then, the station lights flickered. For a split second, the platform went completely dark. When the lights came back on, the man was closer. I hadn't heard him move. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. "Sir?" The lights flickered again. Now, he was even closer. Close enough that I could see his hands, long, bony fingers twitching slightly at his sides. I turned to leave. I didn't care about the train anymore. But as I did, a whisper drifted through the air. "You're going the wrong way." I spun back around. The man was gone. Then, I heard the sound of a train approaching. But something was wrong. The rails weren't vibrating. There was no wind rushing forward. The train wasn't arriving. It was reversing. It slid backward into the station, perfectly silent, like someone had muted reality itself. The doors creaked open, revealing a pitch-black interior. I stepped away, shaking my head. No, absolutely not. The clock above the platform spun faster in reverse. Then, a soft voice came from the train. "Henry, you were supposed to be on this one." I ran. I don't remember how I got home, but later that night, I checked the news. There had been an accident. A train derailed on the Holloway tracks at exactly 1:15 a.m. Every passenger was reported dead, including one named Henry Dawson. That's my name, but I'm still here, aren't I? My name is Lucas, and what happened to me at Millbrook Station, I still can't explain. It was a foggy evening, and the train I was supposed to catch was running late. I had been at Millbrook Station for over an hour, just pacing around, checking the time every few minutes. The station felt unusually quiet, like I was the only one there. I remember looking up at the schedule board. The only train listed now was the last one of the night, the 11:55 p.m. to Ashford. I figured I'd get on that one, even though it was much later than I'd planned. I hadn't heard any announcements or seen any trains, but the board was clear. I waited by the platform, tapping my foot. Then I heard it. The faint sound of a train whistle, far off in the distance. It wasn't supposed to be arriving yet. The tracks creaked under the weight of something large approaching. The train slid into the station, but as it pulled up, I froze. It was unlike any train I had ever seen. It wasn't modern. This train looked old, almost ancient. Its body was covered in rust, the windows cracked, and the doors were locked shut. There was no conductor to be seen. The only light came from a dim, flickering lamp near the front of the train. Curious, I approached the train. The door slid open with an eerie hiss, revealing an empty, shadow-filled interior. A low, constant hum vibrated from within the train, a hum that felt wrong, like it was vibrating in the back of my skull. I was about to step inside when I heard the faintest whisper, "Don't get on." I spun around, but no one was there. The station was empty, too empty. Even the platform was abandoned. I hesitated, but the train doors slammed open again, beckoning me. There was no one else in sight. Something made me get on. I don't know why. I sat in the first seat I could find, just staring ahead at the empty car. I could hear the low hum still vibrating through my body. My heart pounded, but I couldn't get off. The doors slammed shut, and the train started moving. It moved too fast, faster than any train should be able to go, and it never slowed down. I pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. There were no other passengers on board, no conductor, just me and the strange hum. We passed through the countryside, the same landscape repeating itself over and over again. Trees, tunnels, stations, all the same. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time didn't seem to matter anymore. Eventually, the train slowed to a stop, but we were nowhere near Ashford. We were at a station I had never seen. The sign was cracked, the name barely legible. It read, Millbrook. I opened the door, stepping out onto the platform. It looked just like the station I had gotten on at, except darker, older, and abandoned. I turned back to the train. It was gone, no trace of it anywhere, and when I checked the time on my phone, it was still 11:55 p.m. I'm still at Millbrook Station, waiting for a train that will never leave. My name is Oliver. What happened to me at Ashford Station still keeps me up at night. It was past midnight, and I was waiting for the last train home. The station was nearly deserted, except for a station worker mopping the floor and a man in a long coat sitting at the far end of the platform. He kept his head down, his hat obscuring most of his face. The electronic schedule board flickered. My train, the 12:30 a.m. to Harrow, was delayed. Sighing, I sat on a cold metal bench and pulled out my phone. That's when I heard a faint tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. I looked around. The station worker had left, and the man in the coat hadn't moved, but the tapping continued. It was coming from below. Cautiously, I stepped toward the edge of the platform and peered down at the tracks. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. But then something moved. A pale, thin hand shot out from beneath the platform, pressing against the concrete wall. Then another, and then a face. A man was clinging to the underside of the platform, staring up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing broken, yellow teeth. His skin was gray and wrinkled, like something that had been left in the dark for far too long. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard a voice behind me. "You saw him, didn't you?" I spun around. The man in the coat was now standing right next to me. I hadn't heard him move. His eyes were dark, his face expressionless. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered. A loud screech echoed through the station, the sound of an approaching train. I turned back to the tracks, but the thing under the platform was gone. The train pulled in, its doors sliding open with a hiss. The man in the coat stepped inside without another word. My instincts screamed at me not to follow, so I did in single quotes as the train pulled away. I caught a glimpse of the windows. The thing from under the platform was inside, grinning at me. I took a taxi home that night. I haven't used that station since. My name is Elliot, and this is a story I wish I had never been a part of. It happened 2 years ago when I was traveling alone, taking late-night trains to save money on hotels. I found myself at an old, nearly abandoned train station called Blackridge. My phone battery was dead, and the ticket machine was broken, so I had to rely on an outdated schedule board that still had handwritten updates. The station had an eerie stillness. The air was thick with the scent of rust and something rotting. The only sound was the occasional flicker of a dying fluorescent light overhead. The old wooden benches were cracked, and the station walls were covered in faded graffiti. Warnings in languages I couldn't understand. There was only one other person there, an old man in a tattered coat, sitting in the far corner of the waiting area. He never moved, never acknowledged my presence, just stared at the tracks. At exactly 12:15 a.m., a train arrived, an old-fashioned steam locomotive. That was impossible. No trains like this were in service anymore. Yet, there it was, hissing and breathing like a living thing. The doors creaked open, revealing a dark interior with dimly lit, dusty seats. I hesitated, but the old man, finally, spoke. His voice was dry, almost a whisper. "Don't get on. It doesn't stop where you think it does." I looked back at the train. The conductor, a pale, expressionless man in an old uniform, nodded at me, waiting. I checked the schedule again. There was no train listed at this time. Something was very wrong. Then I noticed the passengers. They were seated inside, completely still, their heads down as if they were asleep. But something about them was off. Their clothes were outdated, some from decades ago. Others looked burnt, damaged, like they had survived disasters, but never changed their attire. The train let out a deep, guttural whistle. It wasn't steam. It sounded like a scream. I stepped back, and the old man shook his head. "Smart boy," he muttered. The doors slammed shut. The train didn't pull away in the usual wait, simply disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next, it was gone, leaving only a trail of black smoke that vanished into the night air. The old man stood up and began walking toward the exit. Not everyone gets a second chance. Next time, you won't. I never saw him again, and I never took another midnight train. My name is Daniel. I swear on everything I know, what I'm about to tell you is real. It happened last winter. I was coming home from a business trip, exhausted and desperate to catch the last train of the night. The station was nearly empty, just a few late-night travelers huddled on the benches. I checked the schedule. My train was due at platform 3 in 10 minutes. I made my way there, dragging my suitcase behind me. But as I walked past the empty platforms, I noticed something odd. There was a platform 7 at the very end of the station. That was strange. I had used this station dozens of times before. There were only supposed to be 6 platforms. Curious, I stepped toward it. The overhead sign flickered, its letters struggling to stay visible. 7, 12:45 a.m., arrival. A train was coming. The platform itself felt wrong. The tiles were cracked, the walls damp, as if it had been abandoned for years. I looked around. There were no other passengers, no announcements, no staff. Then, the train pulled in. It was old rusted, its windows fogged up from the inside. The doors opened with a metallic groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. A single overhead light flickered erratically, barely illuminating the narrow aisle. I stepped closer. I don't know why. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe I felt drawn to it. That's when I saw them figures sitting inside, their faces turned away. They didn't move, not even a twitch. Then, as if sensing me, they turned their heads in unison. Their faces were blank, not just expressionless blank. No eyes, no mouths, just smooth, featureless skin. I staggered backward, my heart pounding. A voice whispered from inside the train. A whisper that somehow filled the entire station. "You were supposed to be with us." I ran. I don't even remember how I got back to platform 3, but when I did, my train was there, doors still open. I jumped in just as the whistle blew, not daring to look back. The moment the doors shut, a strange silence filled the cabin. The other passengers were staring at me, their expressions unreadable. I couldn't tell if they were people or something else. I never saw platform 7 again, but sometimes, when I pass that station, I hear a faint, ghostly whisper, "Next time, you won't run."